Thank you very much for attending. This is a session on mis, dis, and malinformation. I'll start by just reading from a piece of paper and talking a little bit about myself as by way of introduction. So I'm Associate Professor in Cyber Threats at the Hillary Rodham Clinton School of Law. I'm also a member of Swansea Cyber Threats Research Centre and a visiting professor with Drew Christian at the University of South Wales. And we both hold a grant looking at EU resilience against hybrid warfare. And that's funded by the EU's Jean Monnet Erasmus Plus scheme. Previously, as many of you know, I was at Aberystwyth University for about 8 years, where I was a reader. And I was also Deputy Director for the Centre for Intelligence and International Security Studies. From 2014 through to 2017, I worked with Airbus Group on a project looking at the cybersecurity lifecycle and industrial control systems. And I was also a member with Carl on the UK's Independent Digital Ethics in Policing panel. I've also done a bunch of other things as well. I've got the nuclear weapons background. I've authored 4 books on the nuclear weapons field. I've done another, I think there may now be 4 books on cyber, which, as Emma will know, because we've been chatting, I'm trying to get published. And I've done quite a number of other articles as well, and plenty of articles in prep. That's enough about me. Emma Bryant, thank you ever so much for attending, Emma. Now, you are one of the key experts, and you really uncovered the Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2018. Most recently, you served as an advisor for a film for People You May Know, which was a documentary released on Amazon Prime on September the 28th. And it says here, please see the trailer at www.metronmedia.com. Please do. Previously, you were senior researcher for the Oscar shortlisted Netflix film, which I really recommend to you if you've not seen it, The Great Hack. As associate researcher at Bard College in upstate New York, you have an extensive background as a professor in information operations, propaganda, and human rights. You analyzed coordination increasing impacts of the digitalization of defense propaganda for your book, Propaganda and Counterterrorism Strategies for Global Challenge, which was published by Manchester University Press in 2015. You spent 13 years researching SCL Group and Cambridge Analytica and trying to divest those 2 companies apart and their internal mechanics. On the basis for
it's breaking up.
Operations submitted to the UK Parliament, to the US congressional committees. And you've lost me for a time. Can you hear me? I'm not going to blame any group of particular hackers. I think that's just one of those things. If you lose me again, I apologize. Dr. Bryant's first book was Bad News for Refugees, published by Pluto Press in 2013, and that examined UK political and media discourse on migration prior to Brexit. David Vigio is a British Academy Global Professor and Visiting Professor of International Intelligence and International Security in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. A delayed move, I believe, but one which I very much hope is going ahead this fall. You're History Fellow for the Army Cyber Institute at the US Military Academy at West Point. David is also Director of Studies for the Cambridge Security Initiative and is co-convener of its International Security and Intelligence Program. David has been a national security practitioner for 20 years. He is a former Central Intelligence Agency's operations officer and remains a senior officer in the US Navy Reserve. Christian. Professor Dr. Christian Cowlett is, I've had to shorten your bio, Christian, I'm afraid. It ran to about 2 pages.
That's absolutely fine.
Sorry. If I miss anything, please feel free to fill in the gaps. Christian is Chair of Policing and Security, as well as Director of the International Centre for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. Christian has researched and taught in many other international universities, a huge number, I should add. You've also been invited as expert of the European Institute for Public Administration, the Counter-Terrorism Committee of the European Parliament, the European Union Institute for Security Studies, the United Nations Development Programme, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Over your career, he has been awarded 7 prestigious Marie Curie fellowships, 4 Jean Monnet chairs, and finally 2 Jean Monnet Centers of Excellence. Additionally, you were awarded a large Horizon 2020 research grant on terrorist radicalization, on the terrorist radicalization process, called Mind Before Act. And you've been an expert for the European Parliament. And to top it all, you're also fluent in 7 languages. I'm not only monolingual, but I don't speak English all that well all the time. Moving on to Carl, who I've known for a number of years, and I've had the real pleasure of hearing him speak before. You're a technology researcher and an award-winning author who's, in your words, thrown yourself into some of the weirdest, least familiar parts of the digital age. His first book, The Death of the Gods, The New Global Power Grab, won the Transmission Prize in 2019. It describes his journey to understand the new sense of power and powerlessness in the digital age, from politics and media to business and warfare. It was published in August 2018 by Penguin Random House. And going back to 2012, you co-founded the first Centre for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos, a London-based think tank. And that is the first UK think tank institute dedicated to studying the digital world. Carl has written for The Economist, Wired, New Scientist, The Sunday Times, The Telegraph, and the BBC. You're also a visiting research fellow at King's College London, and you sometimes present programs for the BBC's flagship technology show, BBC Click. I am done. And that is such an impressive resume from all of you. We agreed between us at the start that this is not a PowerPoint-driven event. This is us talking and trying to grapple with some questions. So to begin, in my mind, I think this is an obvious question, but I could be wrong. How do you perceive differences or the differences between mis, dis, and malinformation? So if anyone wishes to jump in, please jump in. Otherwise, I'm happy to go in alphabetical order. So Emma, to begin with you, being as going by alphabetical order, do you perceive?
I thought that was going to happen somehow. Like, shall I just volunteer? I might as well just volunteer.
Oh, volunteer is even better.
So okay. Now, okay, so the mis-dis malinformation. I see these as like some of these. I suppose picking this distinction or this jumping off point very much, I think, speaks to an approach to take in this area in analyzing, you know, campaigns and falsehood on the internet and so forth. It comes from a concern with false things circulating in our midst that we are concerned about changing our world and impacting, you know, the real world issues such as health debates and, you know, people's take up of vaccines, wars that are taking place around the world, and the way that, you know, information is playing a role in that. And it's very much from the understanding of the public and its role, public opinion, how important it is that that is informed by factual information. And I think the issue here for me is that, like, this takes a falsehood-driven approach. We're worried about consumption. And for me, I tend to take a abuse of power approach that is more focused on deliberate actions and deliberate influence operations than on people circulating things that we don't like. So misinformation tends to be it's falsehoods that perhaps are accidental, or held, a genuine belief is held in something that's not true, and it's circulated because people are wrong about things sometimes. Disinformation is deliberate. So this is where Cambridge Analytica knows something to be false, for instance, and they use that false information deliberately because they think that it will resonate with a particular audience in a political campaign, for example. And I tend to focus more on the deliberate campaigns and the bad actors, if you like, that may be circulating these deliberate falsehoods. So the disinformation side of this. Malinformation it may be truthful information that also might be included in an influence operation, for example, that's deliberate, and it's circulated to hurt someone. So that might be, you've gathered some intelligence about Hillary Clinton and you want to circulate that because you think it'll damage her really badly politically, for example. So I want to be very clear that, like, the stuff that I focus on is the deliberate action. And actually the way that we approach deliberate activities is very different to the way that we should be approaching the activities like misinformation that are not deliberate, and they require very different kinds of responses. And I think often these are rolled up into an argument about all of these things together because we don't like falsehood circulating. But actually, these are really very different activities, and it's really important to sort of crowbar them apart a little bit and say, well, okay, how do we understand and how do we even demonstrate that things are deliberate? Okay, and who's responsible behind this? How do we deal with these kinds of deliberate actions? And how do we allow some space for people to get things wrong, while also, for instance, protecting people from misleading information about public health and so on, and ensuring that they have an ability to make decisions for themselves and review what might be misleading and make an informed judgment. So that would be my response on this particular.
And a superb response. My one quick instant response to that is just to ask you where you think the boundaries might be in terms of free speech and civil liberties and misinformation.
It's a difficult one because, conspiracy theories nowadays are able to take hold in a way that, and spread around the world in seconds in a really, really harmful way. That, okay, we've always had conspiracy theories and so on that people genuinely believed, like rumors that can spread. I mean, all sorts of uncertainties in our world. We try to fill in the gaps as humans. That's kind of what we do, is theorize things and try to, like link things together, sometimes really badly, make horrible mistakes of interpretation, because we want to analyze the world and understand it better. And these theories can be used deliberately by harmful actors and so on, or they can actually just circulate in a way that is kind of natural for us as humans. And there has to be a level of, like, well, you have to allow falsehood online to exist. Now, the issue is when that explodes into something like, after the terrorist attack in New Zealand, where this person who's responsible for horrifying violence is spreading their manifesto, for instance, and it gets around the world in seconds, and it's becomes very, very difficult to control this kind of thing and to mediate the effects of it in an environment with social media, with its engagement and its ability to spread things very, make things go viral so quickly. And also with things like misinformation regarding health, while bad actors can also be pushing this, some of it can be driven just by our anxiety over, genuinely held beliefs and so forth, and misunderstood bad science perhaps, or all sorts of things, and there is an element to which like this obviously creates massive social and health impacts around the world that we have to protect people from. And I would say that it's the medium and the institutions that are projecting this around the world so instantaneously that are the problem here, not so much the falsehood, okay? It's more about like the mass delivery of it. And should we, restrict the ability to amplify something very suddenly around the world if it's false? Now, I think that is where the free speech issue comes in, because it has to be possible to say, well, okay, there's a publication responsibility, perhaps. Well, I don't know, that takes into all sorts of legal areas, but we'll maybe develop this further. But there is perhaps a responsibility to not let stuff become amplified if it's false, but to allow people to, have discussions around things online where they can maybe assert false views. And I think the issue is when powerful actors are driving these kinds of campaigns and exploiting falsehood, that is very different from ordinary people trying to express and understand the world and maybe sharing something that they didn't, know was false. So I think we have to make a distinction here. And this is why I think it's a little problematic sometimes that we tend to focus on the masses and their consumption of propaganda and the prevalence of it online, rather than the institutions and economy that is driving the tools that help it spread, and the data-driven targeting and the algorithms and how it helps the falsehoods to spread online. So I would say that what we should be doing is focusing more on the powerful actors that are driving this and the communication mechanisms, and less on people and how they take it up. Not that we shouldn't be also trying to educate people about what's true. Of course we should. But I think there needs to be more focus on accountability with these powerful actors driving it.
There's a question of accountability and responsibility, and whether central governments could and should regulate or legislate in this space. But I'll leave that to one side.
Can I just add, I'm not saying that, I just want to clarify that I'm not saying central government should be controlling this. I absolutely don't believe that at all. I would say that this requires independent oversight, and there are plenty of models for ensuring that there is independent regulation possible. So I don't think that this should be a matter of government control, and I actually am concerned as well about governments and the way, including in the West, and their use of methods to sort of control what's happening online, which very much are focused on the consumption side of it rather than the bad actors. And I think there needs to be more focus on the bad actors and regulating that industry from a not necessarily self-regulation, but independent regulators that are able to transparently influence in that area.
I don't disagree with you, but to do it apolitically would be challenging.
Yes. Okay.
Desirable, but challenging.
Challenge.
Would anyone like to, rather than go in alphabetical order and treat this as some sort of seminar, would anyone like to come in on the back of Emma's comments?
Chris, I'm happy to come in. I don't think I can improve on how Emma set the table and sort of laid out the various challenges. I think that was really well done. Let me first say, before I jump into what I want to say, that I have to say that as a US government employee, this is just Dave Geo. This isn't, West Point or the Department of Defense or the US government or something. With the disclaimer in the background, I think Emma's absolutely right about the distinctions. I do think that the actors see differences here. For instance, the Russians don't have misinformation campaigns; they have disinformation campaigns. And if you wanted to do a hack and leak or something, I think, as Emma has already said, you could have a malinformation campaign as well. I do think that some of the responses, though, in terms of source criticism, media literacy, not at the policy level, but at the individual level, the shield works for both kinds of ammunition, let's say. So, critical thinking, skepticism, the things that I think we ought to be teaching people, in schools and continuing through their lives, that's effective against misinformation and disinformation, although, as Emma said, they're clearly different. I wanted to just make one quick point that I have absolutely no data to back up other than just sort of one man's view of the world, is that I get the sense, as I've been looking into this, that how we value information in our society, and I think in America for sure, but I think also in the West more generally, is that we value it based on whether or not it's useful for our worldview, right? So if there's a piece of information that we find utility in, either to support our own tribe or our own political pre-convictions or whatever, or it's useful to tear down our enemies online, then we like that information. And if it's true or not is a secondary consideration. And I think that we need to get to a place, I'm not going to say back to a place, because I have no evidence to say that we were there, but I'd love to see us get to a place where information is valued for its veracity and its ability to enlighten and to inform, rather than useful as a tool to bludgeon our enemies. And I think we've somehow made that switch. And I don't know how you study it, and I don't know how you get data, but I think that this sort of transformation of information's utility to value things for its utility instead of for its veracity is one of our underlying problems, and feeds a lot of how quickly disinformation spreads or misinformation spreads, and why people are so receptive to it. Thanks.
Let me, Chris, if I might, let me quickly jump in here too, because that's an important point. If we begin with just focusing on deliberate, coordinated, orchestrated influence campaigns, the utility of the information being deployed in those campaigns is purely instrumental to achieving either a behavioral or an attitudinal effect. That is the only reason you do it, right? And that distinction between mal, disinformation, or anything else is, I don't think that the perpetrators particularly recognize that as being a particularly significant distinction. Like, they don't care whether they're deploying truth or falsehoods or anything in between. They simply care what effect that instrumentally is able to generate. I mean, I've interviewed quite a lot of people that do these campaigns, and they look kind of reasonably confused when I challenge them on questions of well, what, you're poisoning the political atmosphere by circulating these things. They often don't read the stuff that they're deploying necessarily as well. Now, and often then, if you actually try and deconstruct the change models they've got, they actually are not even particularly interested in engaging just on the level of facts or rationality itself. Like, they're much more interested actually in massaging and manipulating and engaging with identity and meaning and reasons for getting up in the morning and community and senses of belonging. All of those, emotional outrage is probably their favorite thing to try and tap into and direct in different ways. They're all much more powerful and predictable ways of getting people to do things online or not do things online, or change their opinions or not change their opinions, than just lying to people. And you know that when you take apart the campaigns, like, you'll see a huge amount of this is based on trying to change how people feel, not what they think. I think we as researchers, we have a far too kind of rational actor model here for both what we're worried about and also what we think the responses to that should be. But that is not what I see happening in terms of the adversary, like their thinking and the tradecraft which has been developed over, say, the last 5 or 10 years in this area.
If I may say, I completely agree. And I'm so frustrated with this focus on falsehood, because falsehood isn't the only unethical thing going on here, and actually it's a small part of a wider campaign when, when we are thinking about these deliberate campaigns. It's something that obviously is a problem from a consumer end point of view, but it's not the only problem. And actually, if you don't think about the entire strategy and all of these different tools that are being deployed just for efficacy, or, as far as they consider this kind of instrumental approach to communicating, if you don't look at all of these and the way that they work together, then you don't understand the campaign that's circulating, or what it's trying to achieve, or what the effect might be even. So I think it's a highly problematic way of approaching it, and it tends to orient us towards solutions of removal that raise issues of free speech, of course. I actually prefer the idea of focusing on those companies, and this instrumental, like whatever works kind of approach has a major moral issue related to it across the board, across data use, across all sorts of different problems that arise, because people only focus on what they want to achieve, and they don't think about, the ethics of how to achieve it or building that in any way, shape or form. So that's why I think a lot of the communicators should be the focus, rather than people and their consumption of falsehoods more readily. So, I think that I'm not saying that we shouldn't care about misinformation, but it's just a totally different phenomenon.
Fascinating. Christian.
Hi, Chris. The way I see it, and I also got that a little bit confirmed by what everybody else said. I have the impression what we're dealing with, in a way, is a kind of a rumor mill on an industrial scale, a rumor mill that is being used in interstate relationships, a rumor mill that is being used in societal relationship, and that is using obviously the latest technology, that is using the latest kind of insights from psychology and then a lot of things. But ultimately, it's a little bit about vulnerabilities, it's a little bit about people's emotions, it's about how they feel, and it's about, in a sense, getting them to feel something, right? It's not about making people think. Very few people think when they hear all those things. Very often it's an emotional response to things. It's about getting at people's emotions. It's manipulating people's emotions, using people's natural emotions, how they would feel about certain issues, and feeding them the type of information that gets the emotional response that in a sense they want to achieve. In a little bit the same way as, you might find in the canteen when people are kind of talking negatively about a colleague or whatever. It's just on an industrial scale. It's much bigger. It's much slicker. It's much better technology. But ultimately, it's doing that type of emotional manipulation that I guess humans have been doing for centuries. It's not something that is new to human development, but it's just the way and the scale in which it can be done, and obviously the how much we've learned about human behavior that we can now insert into those manipulation campaigns. That is something quite incredible, and it is about identifying people's weaknesses, identifying people's vulnerabilities, or identifying people's strengths and turning them into vulnerabilities. It can be a variety of different ways, and using a mixture of truths, falsehoods, and a whole kind of melange of all of these kind of elements, maybe even put in one. So I think it's about all of those things in a sense to achieve, like Carl said, the objective, right? In the end, they don't really care whether they're using even the truth if it fulfills the objective, because even the truth, if we think about it, you know, truth being decontextualized and truth being presented as a truth, but without the kind of surrounding contextual knowledge, can be extremely manipulative. So in that sense, it is about identifying people's vulnerabilities, preying on them, using them, misusing them, and getting people to feel something that maybe they don't want to feel, but kind of deep down, we all have the capacity to feel those things.
Chris, can I jump in? Christian, that was I think a really important point about the truth. And sometimes, you know, we often think that we need that we need a greater context, or if we can decontextualize something, that it's going to help us make our point. And sometimes the truth, as we would all agree it, is still extremely useful. And I think back to, as a historian, you think back to the Cold War and sort of the superpower scramble for Africa. And the KGB had lots of disinformation campaigns, which, you know, we can talk about at some point if you like. But in Africa in particular, they didn't have to lie. They didn't have to decontextualize the truth, and they didn't have to spin the truth. They literally just said, you know, here is the state of race relations in America in the 1960s. And you could have, you know, an eminent historian present it, or you could have the KGB present it. And a lot of ways that they presented it were ways that we would agree, because it was in fact true. And so I think sometimes, you know, we think, oh, well, you know, we're shading things, or there's bias. And that's clearly the case in so many instances. I just wanted to point out, you know, at least some, you know, what active measures or, you know, covert action programs were in fact simply taking a true point and then, you know, holding it up to talk about, you know, American hypocrisy, or, you know, whatever you like. So sometimes truth is truth is truth. And then, you know, that's in the ecosystem as well. Of course, it's truth with a point, but that doesn't make it, you know, shaded or decontextualized or, you know, or whatever.
And on the back of that, I mean, one of the points Christian raised just made me think of the White Camp test from Blade Runner, and from the novel which preceded it. You know, it's trying to identify or invoke an emotional response. It's becoming easier, and we can do it, as you say, at scale. One of the questions that's sort of been milling around in the midst of this, so I'm sort of not going by notes now or anything, but it's a question for me of, partly at least, of identity politics, and maybe the fracturing of the bipolar system post-Cold War into a much more multipolar, much more difficult to understand world, which we're trying to navigate and make sense of. And a number of the quote unquote bad actors are making play in this space. They're tapping at the fractures within society, whether they've developed or evolved, whether they're finding ways of tapping gently to open cracks between people and between societies. Would any of you like to speak to that?
I would just like to say that yes, and that is, truth is the biggest and easiest tool to use for doing this, because there are so many, you know, different ways that you can view history from. And if you just amplify the different, you know, perceptions about real world events from, you know, opposing points of view, they, you know, they may well be very truthful. I mean, look at the divisions in US society, for example, or in the UK in terms of history and its constituent nations. There's plenty that you can amplify that is truthful about the history in order to divide people. You don't have to lie. And actually, this is the stuff that really, really gets to people and can, you know, provoke long, deep-seated tensions. I'll let somebody else jump in, but I just wanted to emphasize that fact that, what David was saying about the importance of the truth, because I think we forget this a lot of the time.
And again, when you actually tear these campaigns apart, you see them, you see the same single unitary organized actor squatting on all the different parts of the political landscape, not trying to really make one part of it beat another, but actually to make all of them angry at every other part. I mean, that is probably the one consistent strategic kind of thing that we see time and time again in all these campaigns. I mean, so really, like, to shift it then, I mean, and I'd invite any other panelists to kind of maybe disagree with me. Like, to me, like, this panel and lots of panels like it should really be worried about the way in which nation states are like stepping into and beginning to like rummage around and interfere with the socio-cultural kind of contemporary histories of other nation states all over the world. Like, that to me is the prospect we're now facing. We don't really have a workable series of solutions to it yet. We're trying to pressure the platforms, we're trying to do digital literacy, but it's really not clear to me that any of the things that we're proposing are going to stand up in the face of, the kinds of sophistication that we know will come with military scale budgets around the world, which is what this is now a creature of. And we haven't even begun to deploy what I think probably would be a more powerful array of tools, which are state power tools, which sounds strange for a liberal think tanker to begin to say, but to me, like, I mean, NATO should have some kind of informational defense clauses they should be discussing right now. Like, we have to work out ways of increasing the cost and difficulty for nation states to do this, not just during elections, but actually during other divisive, difficult, dangerous, thorny moments, and just every day. Because, I mean, the budget of RT is a couple of tanks, like, annually. Like, this is not expensive or difficult for militaries to do. They're going to keep doing it until we can work out ways to deter and increase the cost of them doing so. To me, like, when we continue to fixate on these questions of truth and lies, it kind of puts us on a series of rails towards a series of responses which I think are grotesquely unevenly unsuited for where that threat's going to get to.
Yeah, Carl, I couldn't agree more. And as someone who sort of knows a little something about military budgets, right? I mean, imagine if you took, one F-35, right? And just said, hey, we're not going to build that system. We're going to teach, adults media literacy in public libraries. Well, is that going to work? I don't know, but it's at least worth trying. I think one of the military budget is, as you said, sort of military scale budgets. I mean, this is exactly why they do it, because it's cheap. I mean, if you look at what the Russians have spent, in Facebook ad spends or across other places, you can have RT is a perfect example, right? You can have a bullhorn in 100 and something countries, that it's in, and it's pennies. And I think that it's the asymmetry in the conventional sense. That is why at least the Russians are pushing back, right? They want to push back against NATO. They want to push back against, Western narratives and whatever. And so how they do that is they say, well, we can't build 11 aircraft carriers. We can't, have, squadrons and squadrons of elite fighter planes. We don't have the best nuclear submarines. But we watch a lot of, House of Cards, and we have RT, and let's get to work. And here in the States, if you look, so I spend most of my time looking at adversarial campaigns as opposed to domestic campaigns, but I fully acknowledge that domestic campaigns are more problematic in lots of ways. But for me, I'd like to look at how intelligence services, mount influence operations. And if you just go back to the Russians, I've been keeping a list of all of the ways in which the Russians have been doing what Chris talked about, taking a seam. And I give them credit because they did their homework. They know us really well. They know us far better than we know them. And maybe even, from a Sun Tzu point of view, than we know ourselves. And so I every time I talk about this, I add baskets of memes, that come from Russians in particular. And I'm up to, I think, 7. And just quickly, maybe for fodder for conversation, guns and Second Amendment issues, The meaning of patriotism, right? Should I stand? Should I not stand? Should I take a knee? You know, should we recite the Pledge of Allegiance? Religion, of course. Immigration, what the Russians sometimes call cultural identity issues or values. You even hear that now. You know, I'm a values voter, whatever that means. Race and racism, of course. A new one that I think they've played on is the establishment versus real people. You know, sort of getting in that you know, sort of rural urban divide. And then also veterans issues, right? And you know, we have a civ mil divide in this country because we put our military on this pedestal for reasons that we could go into, but you know, sort of not really germane. You know, and the Russians want to separate, you know, sort of the hero worship, you know, from average people. And so when you put all that together, I really feel like they've done their homework, and you can look at what they've done. And I think you know, the precondition for a successful campaign is to go with the grain of what people want to think or what people think already. You know, you can't make a bunch of memes and say, you know, actually it's the moon's gravity that keeps us on the ground or whatever. No one's going to believe that because that doesn't jive with their lived experience or what they think they know. But if you can get into these fissures where there's already a strong current and kind of swim along with it, I think it's much more effective. And you know, look, my hat's off to the Russians for figuring it out.
One of the events I looked at when I was looking very, very closely and work I've yet to publish on the 2016 US presidential election, Russian key interference thereof, and the way they timed it. You know, you talk, there's this sort of, I'm a huge football fan and a soccer fan. And it's timing you right into the box. They timed their messaging to great effect. So that understanding that David speaks to, absolutely. Heart of text has been one of the sort of messaging schemes. And for a couple of protests, they message people to perform direct action on two distinct and separate groups. So they were opposing one another on separate sides of the street. And it's Russian messaging. They brought out upon Russian messaging. It's amazing. Well, amazing in the sense of I was almost going to say I tip my hat to them. I don't, because it's a little bit too easy. Because we've almost created the conditions to allow this. Sorry, Emma.
Oh, I just wanted to say, I wanted to come back on what Carl and David have said a little bit by saying that I don't think that NATO isn't involved in also, you know, very heavily trying to, you know, act in the strategic communication space. I mean, we are focusing on that and have been for quite a long time. Yes, it's not to the same extent that you fund hard power. It costs a heck of a lot less to put some, you know, messaging out on Facebook than it does to buy fighter aircraft. But, you know, the issue is also, especially within the US, about, you know, what you're allowed to use military funds for, obviously. The issue is that, you know, the military is not supposed to target American citizens, and any kind of educational strategy needs to come out of the Department for Education, not, you know, not the military budget. It actually, you know, requires a shift in the way that we maybe look at, you know, federal budget spending and so on, and an understanding that actually certain tools are just not appropriate and are not necessarily the immediate response that you have to disinformation. In the UK, I think, and in Canada, they have rather messed this up, because like recently in the coronavirus response, in the UK, we used 77th Brigade to help with the strategy of the Cabinet Office was deploying to communicate on coronavirus. Now, the people who are most paranoid about coronavirus messaging, those people when they see that 77th Brigade is involved in helping to shape the communications program that's communicating coronavirus and vaccines and mask wearing and all this kind of public health campaign, they're obviously going to reject any messaging. You need a complete separation in, you know, who is involved in these kinds of activities. If it's public health and public, you know, education, even if 77th Brigade, you know, aren't doing anything misleading, it's going to set up, you know, these are the people who do deception operations. Okay, this is gonna set up problematic, you know, credibility issues. And I think, you know, NATO taking the lead on this, in its spheres of influence is also not really that helpful. You know, we need to be thinking differently about how to do this, and that doesn't mean covertly funding entities to become, you know, putting out, you know, a strategic communication campaign that you know, look like they're not government funded but are. I think we need to be thinking really very differently about how to approach this in a way that builds trust. And at the moment, we're not really. I think putting it in the hands of militaries is, if anything, going to build paranoia, not solve this issue.
Can I, Emma, no, I take that point 100%. I actually meant take it away from the military altogether.
Oh,
we don't need it, right? You know, I mean, my point is not, you know, spend out of the military budget. My point is, as you say, take it away from the military and put it into the Department of Education, put it into the CISA, Critical Infrastructure Security Agency. I can't remember what that stands for, right? Plus up rumor control, plus up that kind of stuff. So yeah, no, I don't want the military really doing this either. As you said, there is a role for NATO, Stratcom COE, right? I think, which is in Riga, if I'm not mistaken.
Tallinn.
Well, there's the cyber one in Tallinn, but there's also a strategic communications one as well. Not as well known, but definitely important, and they put out some good stuff. The only place, Emma, that I would say that we should use military funding for this is on the military itself. And what I mean by that is something like 20% of the 6th January Capitol rioters were veterans, and that alarmed the hell and embarrassed the hell out of the Department of Defense. And what that suggests, I think, is that veterans were overrepresented in that mob. And so what that means is maybe we need to spend, you know, a couple of minutes less talking about, you know, who can do the most push-ups, and a couple of more minutes talking about, you know, what do people want from us when they are when there's a campaign, you know, targeting veterans or targeting the military community. So I think there's a small role for the military in terms of making ourselves more resilient to this stuff, but absolutely no, I don't want the military running, you know, domestic, you know, or the intelligence service or whatever. I think that CISA has done a good job, and I'd be curious for your thoughts, you know, for the UK version. But it seems like, so there's NSA, right, and then that sort of through some kind of magic box sends things to the Critical Infrastructure Security Agency, and then that gets put out, right, as rumor control. And in the UK, right, you've got GCHQ, and then you've got the National Cybersecurity Center, which puts out, you know, sort of digital health warnings, as it were. And I wonder if there's a way, or if this is happening, but we just don't quite understand the contours of it, to take what the government knows is happening, but can't be released for whatever reason, and sort of filter it through these other entities in order to get it out to the people, the public, who need to be aware of it.
Carl, Christian? Do you have any comment?
Well, I just wanted to point out how difficult I think it is, in a sense, to control it entirely, because I think there's all sorts of things that we can do to make it better. But I think ultimately what we're dealing with is, in a sense, dormant conflicts within societies, and every society has trillion dormant conflict. I mean, in your role as a historian, your professional duty is to kind of write about all of these historical conflicts that have a history, that have, you know, an origin, that have people that were taking part in it, people that have now turned their attention towards something else, but they're kind of there because it existed, and all of those conflicts potentially can be used to, in a sense, influence societies. And if you just think about the history of Europe and the bloody history of Europe, you can just imagine the multitudes of possible conflicts that can be used to manipulate people. If you think about the amount of people that in their families, would have at some point been involved in some of those conflicts, either on the perpetrator side, either on the victim side, or so on. All of these people that have turned a leaf and are now looking forward, but given the right manipulation, could be looking backward. And when you think about all of that, then you see how difficult it is, in a sense, to protect you from all of them, because in a sense, education, probably, as much as I'm in favor, I mean, I'm an education man, right? So I'm certainly in favor of education. But what I'm saying is it's probably not sufficient, because it is just so much that there is, and it holds so many deeply felt emotions that people have kind of, you know, worked through, but that, you know, you can work backwards again. And because of all of that, I think it's not so easy to easily protect yourself. So in a sense, what you need, in a way, is identifying who the people are at a very early stage. I'm not saying shutting them down. So I'm not saying immediately shutting everything down, but identifying who the perpetrators are, what conflict they're after. I mean, just to give you an example, the refugee crisis, right? It was one of those conflicts that were being spun from a very, very early stage. If you look at what the Russians were doing in the refugee crisis, they were spinning a story about refugees as terrorists well before there were any refugees even in Europe. You know, they were already the propaganda organs of Russia Today, Sputnik News, kind of trumpeting those stories around, that were then picked up by the various media, by their own kind of amplifiers within the various societies, that were building an image before the event had even happened. Yeah. So in a sense, having an early warning system there would, in a sense, give us an indication where we need to react. In a sense, you can't know all of the conflicts that people could possibly manipulate, but having an early warning system, a kind of a system that tells us, look, you know, these are the kind of stories that they're spinning at the moment. So this is what we need to kind of do to prepare for that. I think that's kind of how you can react at a very early stage before the entire story is spun. Because once the story is spun, it gets more difficult, because then for people in their own head, it has become the truth. You know, how many people really question deeply whether some of the refugees were in fact terrorists, whether even the term refugees is an appropriate term for what we saw, and all of those kind of things. You know, people don't, once a story is spun, really question them very deeply anymore. They kind of take it as accepted wisdom. So we, as a society, to protect ourselves, we need to react before it becomes the accepted wisdom. We need to kind of react at a very early stage, trying to understand what story is being spun here. And I think that's that. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question on the back of that, Christian? What you seem to be alluding to is the balkanization of liberal democracies, Western Europe, part of North America, and the sort of the grappling with identity politics and fragmentation of societies, the loss of anchors, the loss of certainty, and globalization, and the world's complicated. Well, I want a simple narrative, so that's the alternative. I'll take the simple narrative over the complex explanation. And these, I say these actors, perhaps we should talk about who these actors are, but specifically, but in general, it's tapping away those sort of fault lines and worries in people, and the need for simplifying the world and not looking at it as a complex series of problems and questions.
Yeah, I mean, most people don't have time to be thinking deeply into what they kind of, in a sense, experience in their life. They're just taking things a little bit at face value. And I mean, we can teach in education to be a little bit more critical, and I think that's a good thing. But we should also realize that there are limits to what we can expect from people, because in the end, people have busy lives. They go about their job, they have their families, they do all sorts of stuff. They don't think forever about what's going on around them. So the space that you have to really shape what they feel and what they think is, you know, there's a certain moment where you can shape it. And once that moment passes, your ability to still shape it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, because they think that they know what they know. And then it becomes much more complicated. And obviously we want to reduce complexity. There's no doubt about that. And I think that's a human condition. We want to know quickly what we know. We want to understand the world quickly, and all of those things are in a sense necessary. It's very difficult to kind of go against it. I think it's more understanding how people behave and accepting that, because in a sense people are people, right? But rather adapting to that from the point of view of giving them the tools to in a sense understand what's going on around them quickly. And I don't have like a perfect solution, right? I'm just kind of hypothesizing from the limited experience of having followed some of those crises, and thinking back and thinking, well, I think if we had reacted a little bit faster here, we could have shaped this political event, and so on. And I think there's definitely something to think about.
Thanks, Christian. Carl, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I mean, just a brief thought is that Western militaries engaging in information warfare will be strategically inept, because this is never going to be a theatre in which Western militaries are ever, or the West in general, is ever going to win. We rightly have far more. The limiting factor here is legal permissibility. It isn't technical possibility. Like, this is child's play for militaries across the world to be able to manipulate online spaces. This really isn't difficult for them to do. The limiting factor is the law and the extent to which we tolerate our militaries mucking around with things like a free press and exposing their citizens to their information operations and so on. And in that sense, I always see autocracies to have if not a technical advantage, then certainly much greater freedom of movement than any kind of informational rules of engagement that we might draft, but which, by the way, we actually need to do. And it's striking to me that we haven't actually published rules of engagement in the information space yet. The only other thought I have is that the real way forwards here is demilitarizing information. For any of us that actually care about information having a kind of a value unto itself, as like a kind of civilizational, having a civilizational value, for all of us who are writers or researchers, the empiricists, or poets, anyone that cares about information as something other than something we deploy to kind of generate a behavioral or attitudinal effect. It should matter to us all very, very greatly and deeply that this idea is currently as powerful and as fast changing. And I think in the hands of the people that use it, as exciting as it is, I think this information warfare as an idea is completely changing the world at the moment. And we absolutely need to start finding ways not of just engaging in that, but de-escalating it. And they're like, actually, the good news, I guess, is that civic society has become so much more galvanized and energized over the last kind of 4 or 5 years in kind of building capability to begin to detect these operations and do something about them. But if there is a role in militaries, and this is kind of what I was saying before, I think is it all in states more generally. I think it's in states kind of leaning on a kind of asymmetrical responses. Like, I don't want the West, America or the UK or elsewhere to be fighting Russia or China or Saudi Arabia in the information space, but I do want us to be using economic and political measures when states begin to be to very deliberately deploy information operations against us at times of, say, national crisis. I think that's completely legitimate for the West and for NATO to consider multilateral responses, say economic sanctions or diplomatic sanctions, in those kinds of contexts. We haven't really done much of that yet. I think that is the way in which we're going to make deploying these operations become costlier, not in obviously a financial sense directly, but basically increasing the cost of doing business. Otherwise, I just think we're going to see over the next kind of 10 years this become like so much more sophisticated and probably start spreading into information spheres which are more consequential than the ones we've seen this deployed in so far. So currently, to me, the kind of lowest barriers to entry have obviously been social media platforms. That's where a lot of this stuff is first deployed. But what if I was an information warfare officer? Like, I'd be thinking, great, well, okay, let me hit the more important platforms online first. So let me attack Wikipedia. I don't care about Facebook, but I do care about Wikipedia. And then let me go after financial information. Let me go after the stock market. Let me go after medical information. Let me start mucking around with the way in which state medical bureaucracies work. There's a lot higher stakes targets out there than the ones that we are currently worrying about. So we have to get this right now, because the costs are going to start going up greatly. Right now we just aren't able to levy costs which I think are commensurate with the kinds of damage that this is going to be able to cause. And as David says, it's completely right. What we are facing here are a series of adversaries that know that they have no reasonable prospect of responding to a strategic overmatch in conventional military capability. Like that is the basic kind of like calculus which is driving a lot of this stuff, at least as it's coming from states.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And as someone who's written a book yet to be published on attacking critical infrastructure, I also agree with you. There are wider orbits at work and deeper forces, but it's full spectrum. It's full spectrum as regards states. We have a number of questions. We're not going to get through all of them. There is a guide for us. But I like the question that you put, Emma, so I've bumped it. And it's, what are the best ways to research the actors behind disinformation and influence operations, both foreign and domestic? And we've all done this. We are, all of us, active researchers. So what do we think?
I can jump in very quickly if you like, just to I have a team of 20 that basically do disinformation and information operations research for a living, and there's broadly kind of two different kind of main bodies of thought and method really that you call upon here. The first is kind of open source intelligence, which is a weird grab bag really of lots of different techniques, but they're very useful often to uncover the bits that the other branch of research really can't. So OSINT is brilliant at trying to uncover hidden links, hidden organizational links, hidden links of ownership and so on. And you basically try and wrap that together with data science. Like basically on a daily basis, it's dueling maths. Like we run models and train models that try and understand like how the ways which you can try and manipulate spaces online leave perceivable breadcrumbs and patterns, which you then try to spot. Basically, what civic society more broadly is trying to do at the moment is recreate the kind of defensive teams which the tech giants have set up. They've set up exactly these kinds of things internally to defend each platform, and we're trying to do that externally, to feed into public debate and journalism and so on. The thing that's missing, very, very, very lastly, is I think more investigative journalism. By which I don't mean just writing about campaigns which you can see online, which basically every journalist has been doing for years now and is actually extremely easy and obviously cheap to do. I mean actually like digging into like who is really behind this. There's a whole pantheon of private PR companies that are kind of selling their services to states that we haven't really uncovered much of yet. I mean, they're pitching this to governments all over the world. There's pitch decks. There's interests at work. There's real kind of financial and organizational realities behind a lot of this stuff, which could be exposed, and that could lead to kind of action both by states and others. So that to me is the kind of golden triarchy really. You've got kind of data science able to cope at scale, kind of open source intelligence and all the things that can find online, and then kind of allied to that investigative journalism. And it's about wrapping those three unfamiliar bedfellows often together to kind of build capability, which you then try and deploy.
Absolutely fascinating, Carl. Thank you so much. But I was coming to you. We have a psychic connection. I was coming to you.
Thank you. I think this is a good point to jump in with it because, yeah, I do very different type of research to Carl, in that I focus on those actors. And one of my frustrations has been with investigative journalism as the only response focusing on the actors, is that it focuses in on high profile case studies. So it only really cares about, like, okay, so if Russia is in the news as on our biggest enemy, then they'll focus on Russia and its, you know, campaigns. Or if you know, Trump is being focused on and his disinformation, then they'll focus on finding, you know, Trump campaign firms and amplifying those kinds of actors, because that's what's in the news at the moment. And the issue is that there are very few academics who are doing this kind of research because it's hard, it's risky, they attack you. I know from personal experience. And it also isn't big data often. It's very difficult, you know, it's going to require a collaborative approach with lots of academics and perhaps collaborating with journalists who maybe want to do the high profile stories that people want to read. But we need to also know about the actors that are less well known, that may not be, you know, maybe, you know, unfolding really important disinformation operations, but they're not the ones that are going to hit the media because they're not the ones that, you know, we care about at the moment. And the issue when we have these, you know, individual case studies popping out in the media is we don't really get a sense of, you know, what is this phenomenon at scale? How big is the industry? You know, what are the money flows? Like, who are the main players? If we only focus on a few ones that we are interested in today, because they're newsworthy right now, then we don't really know the kind of, you know, whole ecosystem out there of the industry, what are the money flows, you know, what roles different governments versus political actors might play. And I think, you know, I mean, I focus on this, but I tend to do qualitative research. So I have, you know, a network of contacts and so on that I use, and I find out about things that aren't maybe on visible in an obvious way through, you know, just looking at social media, through data science, or looking at even open source intelligence kind of analysis isn't going to highlight things that only my contact is going to tell me or whatever. Now, basing things on networks of contacts obviously has its own like bias and so on, and preferences certain groups of people, and it's small scale, but it does also sort of reveal things and companies and entities and so on that wouldn't necessarily be known about otherwise and is impossible to find through other means. So I think we need more of this kind of work, and those people need to come together. I don't know very many people who do this, particularly as it's not the kind of in way of doing disinformation research now. Everybody got very excited about tracking, you know, the spread of posts online, and not very many people got excited about trying to research the entities, particularly as it's kind of dangerous, honestly. So we need more kind of support for this kind of research, and it not just being done by journalists because of the news value. It needs to be done also by people like me, by researchers and academics who are more interested in things that aren't necessarily newsworthy in the same way.
I couldn't agree more. I said to Christian last week that in answer to a question that was put by an audience member was the importance of good people, good teams networking between us. it's everything, and funding. Getting these elements in place. Just one quick housekeeping point. I'll leave, if I can, half an hour for questions at the end from the audience. There are 3 questions in the chat already. Please, for those of you out there, feel free to post more. We'll try and get around to them in the next 70 minutes. Does anybody else wish to come in at this point? I think I was such a good, it's not so much a question, a plea more than anything for better collaboration and better ways of doing things. Sometimes too often, perhaps we work in silos. I don't like working in silos. I like working with people. I like people. Excuse me if we've answered any of this in passing. I suspect we might have done, because this has been a superb chat. What does misdis and malinformation, why does misdis and malinformation spread? And how might we encourage greater critical thinking? I think we've covered this. I beat the drum for critical thinking skills, education. They do it well in the Nordics. Christian has spoken to this. A number of us have spoken to this. Do any of us wish to add anything to that?
I'll go, Chris, if I might. Just 2 quick points. The first one is I was writing a paper with a colleague, and there's this sort of no one knows who said it type quotes. But one of them is that a lie is halfway around the world while the truth is still getting its shoes on, or its boots on, or its pants on, or whatever. And a friend of mine actually pointed me to some research that says actually in our digital age, lies travel 6 times faster than the truth. So you can go back to Mark Twain or Jonathan Swift or whoever you want to attribute the original quote to, and say actually it's 12 times worse than that, or I don't know, maybe it's exponential. I don't.
I'll tell you what I did to David is Machiavellian and Il Principe, Prince, which is about middle of the 16th century.
Yeah, so it certainly goes back. I wanted to just I think your question asked why, and we can talk about responses later, and I think that's where some of the questions are going. But I wanted to give just like 2 sort of I guess shout outs to 2 different sort of governmental approaches. The first one are the Swedes. I don't know if you track this, but the Swedes have a pamphlet that they've put out called "If War or Crisis Comes," and it's put out by their Civil Contingencies Agency, the MSB. Don't ask me to say what it stands for. And they actually, so it was out from 1943 to the end of the Cold War, and it basically said, look, if you hear that we've surrendered, we haven't, and it sort of has a, here's what to do in the case of nuclear exchange. Here's what to do, I don't know, electromagnetic threats or terrorist threats. Well, after the Cold War, there was no reason to have it, right? It was the end of history. Everyone was getting along. Well, in 2018, the Swedes re-sent it out to every Swedish household, and so it actually has a great list, and it's not in front of me, but the section is entitled "False Information," and it actually comes before terrorism. It comes before invasion, and I think that's probably right, because this is the stuff that can really hurt you. And the Swedes say, look, they're asking their citizenry to ask 3 or 4 questions, and it's basically what, as a historian, I would just say, hey, they're asking them to do the historical method. It's who put this out, why did they put this out, why is this out now, is the source genuine, and we don't even ask people to do that, and the Swedes are so far ahead. And the Finns as well. The reason why the Finns are so far ahead in media literacy, it's not because they're born, source critics, is because they teach it. We don't teach it. I have a first grader, and I ask him all the time, is this fact, is this opinion, but he doesn't get it at school. And so, I feel like, it's no surprise, that certain countries are doing better. It's because they care. It's because they put attention and resources against the problem. And, certain countries that aren't, say, fabulously wealthy, you take maybe Estonia as an example. They have civil, like little civil defense type, they have a website, maybe y'all have seen, called Propostop. And they have it in German and in Estonian and English and in Russian. And it's sort of like a Snopes for disinformation. And I'm not saying one of these is correct. I'm just saying, imagine if we started to grapple with the problem the way these other ones did. I think that, if source checking itself isn't really gonna help us with computational propaganda. I think, as Christian has already said, it's too big, but it can certainly go a long way toward making it less effective and dividing us.
Sorry, I got pulled out of that. That my password expired. What I would say, someone who spent a good chunk of time in Estonia and sometime in the Nordics, it's also an issue of proximity. They're used to it, they expect it, they know what's coming from across the border. They also know if they roll the tanks through, they can't defend themselves. They're become embedded in the EU, Western liberal democratic model, and absolutely with NATO, but also with the value system. I've heard their president speak, and a number of their senior politicians speak. We have a shared value system. And as they say, our way is better than yours. In terms of, we don't put opposition journalists in prison. We don't outlaw opposition organizations. We encourage free speech, which is where I was sort of alluding to Emma earlier. There's a little bit of tension between, to what extent do we try and root out at source the issues of dismiss and malinformation, and to what extent do we let them flow through society and let critical thinking skills take hold? That's perhaps a broader question. Does anybody else wish to step in? Any big point? We have lots of questions. I'm trying to find a good one. This relates to what we've just been talking about. Do you think combating misdis and malinformation flows requires a whole of nation response, a societal response? To what extent, and I won't do the second half of the question, but that whole of nation response, it's certainly replete in US policy documents and in organizations like CISA and a number of others. So David, if I can begin with you.
Well, I absolutely think it does. I mean, like any hard question, the responses are going to be, legal, ethical, moral, societal, civil, down to neighborhood leaders, right? Like with vaccines, right? I mean, they're trying to trot out, trusted neighborhood leaders, right, to combat disinformation. So, yeah, absolutely. I think the trouble comes in what is a whole of government response, right? As Emma said, well, so if, in America, if the military, is, does it, as Rosa Brooks said, the military is Walmart or something, right? If you want a tennis racket, the military will do that for you. If you want some bananas, the military will do that for you. And so what is a whole of government response, and who's on board, right? And who's not, and who do we need to keep out of it? And there was a SUFON report that, I think, as I look at this stuff, friends are always reminding me, and I've said it earlier, that the domestic bit is hard. The foreign bit, right? That's easy, but they intertwine in ways that are hugely problematic. And as soon as there's a domestic angle, a lot of, at least the U.S. government has to get out of it. And so, how do you deal with foreign amplification of domestic things, or domestic amplification of foreign things? And so, who do you want at the table? And I thought I would just read for you a quick SUFON report quote talking about this problem of entangling information. Throughout 2020, the consistent foreign amplification of QAnon narratives online illustrates that externally driven disinformation efforts have contributed to the efficient spread of conspiracy theories. Indeed, the level of foreign influence during January and February 2021 continues this trend at an average of almost 20% of all posts analyzed. So, we have exquisite security services. We have exquisite intelligence services. Military is peerless. But who do you want at that table? And what is a whole of government approach? And so I think it's really important. And I think the easiest answer, yes. The hard answer is who gets what role. And I think, as Carl said, how do you determine the lanes of the road? Who do you want at the table, and what legal authorities are there, right? Because as soon as you get the legal authorities question in front, then you're going to have massive disagreements. And so I think the prima facie answer is, of course, yes, but the harder answer is I don't know if anybody can agree on what the whole of government looks like and in what circumstances it would be used.
Perhaps we need another version of Hobbes and the social media contract. Carl, you were mentioned. Would you like to come back or say anything?
No, I mean, I mean, in many ways, like we actually haven't. I mean, I've been waiting for the kind of philosophy to kind of outline the whole new kind of system of rights and responsibilities and gaps, and in exactly where the Hobbes did, with the rise of the modern state. I perhaps that was a throwaway, Chris, but it's actually something I've been thinking about for quite some time now.
Well, it was, but I've thought about it like you, and I think it holds water. I think it has credence.
Yeah, because the way I see it, I mean, let's dwell on philosophy for a moment. Like a lot of these information operations, like that doctrine, is in many ways kind of exploiting a whole family of like 19th century kind of Enlightenment ideals around an informed society and good, Locke and all the utilitarians and Bentham and good ideas winning out over bad. We've got this whole kind of clutter of assumptions really we've been holding for quite some time around basically the truth rising to the top, and that's just not true. It's not congruent with human nature. It's not by any means a concomitant or a necessary product of a society. I don't think it's empirically bearing itself out really either. A lot of the institutions and values that we have still revolve around basically trying to just enlarge the universe of information which people can come in contact with, because somehow, as long as you equip them with the right critical thinking skills there, they'll be able to kind of navigate their way through. In many ways, I don't think that's a tenable position to be of a theory of knowledge really to be holding about the world nowadays. I think the kind of noxious and powerful kind of new ways in which you can massage attention in certain ways and exploit dopamine studies and exploit cognitive psychology, and as I think lots of panelists have been talking about, basically use the vulnerabilities which human beings have always had in ways which are very reliable and extremely powerful for geopolitical ends and many other ends as well. We haven't really spoken about, say, extreme politics, but there's another group that loves using all of these ideas and the same tradecraft. Yeah, I think that liberal Enlightenment kind of theory or framework falls away very quickly. And what I haven't yet seen, and I would love someone to tell me what it is the philosophy which replaces that, which can both kind of like reflect and cherish like all the kind of like the entire scientific method and truth and knowledge and free speech and all the freedoms and liberties which we now hold really dear, but do so in with a realistic understanding of how information societies in the digital age actually really work. So that's more of a plea, I think, really, than an answer, Chris. But I would love to see the new Hobbes rise at some stage.
There's a spat of dialogue in one of the Batman films, and it's between Alfred and Batman, and it's his alter ego, and it's, I don't understand this world. You don't need to understand, you just need to save it. And it speaks. I mean, I feel disorientated sometimes. It's information overload. It's, you lose your anchors. And there's so much of everything, and there's not enough time, it seems, to pause to think, as we were trying to do when we were on the police force, just to think through the ethical, the social, the practical, the moral issues attached to all this. I mean, it's tough.
May I?
Sorry, Emma.
I have so the kind of philosophy around propaganda that Carl's alluding to, I think, is this kind of notion of the black, white, and gray, and the fact that, you know, we have this separation of like that's very much rooted in an old media world, where the internet hadn't caused everything to flow in every direction, and where we you know, had this kind of very clear separation between different activities that we, you know, that was there for reasons of legitimacy and protection of domestic populations from their own government's propaganda and so forth. And there's an extent to which that this sort of, you know, moral code, if you like, or the boundaries there are still in existence. But my worry is actually that we already have this new doctrine. It's just not being really published. I mean, the last sort of 6 years or so, the way things have changed, if not longer, really concerns me. And the fact that we are sort of evolving, especially in the last couple of years, our thinking in our, well, our government's thinkings, military's thinkings, around the way that the information environment is changing and the way that it needs to be handled really feels like an abandonment of certain principles to me, from the point of view from which I'm witnessing. I think that they don't really have a clear plan, as far as I can see, but we are moving in this concerning direction without the clear plan, and certainly not one that has been properly communicated to the public. And that worries me greatly, because I think there's a sense that people think that we need to innovate. And by that, they mean somewhat selling out on our traditional principles. And for me, I think this is actually a strength of democracies, is that we hold these particular principles and that we do not bend when it comes to targeting domestic populations. And, you know, if we feel that we need to deploy the same tools, which indeed I think we have done very much so on occasions, I think this is a very worrying trend. And there seems to be some experimentation with moving in that direction, which I find very concerning. There's a lot less transparency over information operations than there used to be, especially in the UK. And I'm really worried about these kinds of developments and the debate happening behind closed doors.
Right, no, I agree. Christian, David, do you wish to say anything? What? Oh, David, please.
Well, I mean, I'd like to defer to Christian if you'd like to come in. He's the man in the shadows, figurative.
Sorry, I was going to ask you the same thing, but
we're very polite people.
Well, you know, I mean, having you know, I think Emma's right, but I think that, you know, the military, I get the sense that the government doesn't know what to do, and I think that's where all the flailing comes in. And I think that lawyers aren't really signing off on very much at all, because nobody knows what to do. It's a little bit like the cyber problem. So, you know, to be honest, I haven't seen much innovation. What I've seen is that people just want to ignore it and hope that it goes away. So, you know, I don't think that they're marching off in any particularly alarming direction. I think they're waiting for someone to tell them what to do, and they'll just sort of admire the problem. But this is not coming as a historian. This is just sort of coming as, you know, as one who's been, you know, sort of swimming in those circles. But I also want to know how effective, you know, so I mean, we don't know how to measure counterfactuals. You know, I think that's the real problem, you know, and it gets back to Russians in 2016, and everyone has a different idea for, you know, does this stuff matter? You know, and you have people saying, you know, on one hand, you know, the Russians, you know, tipped a close election to Trump. And then on the other hand, people are saying, yeah, the amount of noise that's in the information ecosystem, and the Russians were responsible for, 0.02% of it or whatever, it didn't really matter. And how do you run these, how do you run these campaigns? And, in my previous life as an intelligence officer, I have run covert influence operations, overseas, of course, not targeting Americans in any way, shape, or form. But the bill payers always want to know, is it working? And I have no honest answer for that, because I don't know how people would think or would act if I weren't there, if I wasn't spending this money on all these things that I'm trying to do. And so I think we sort of get back to almost do we think it's useful? Yes, no, or do we not think it's useful? Yes, no. But nobody wants to pull the plug, because what if it might have been useful? It's a little bit like advertising, right? Was I going to buy that toothpaste anyway? So I think that it's very hard to measure, and I'd welcome other sort of ideas about that.
Yeah, just to follow up, I fully agree with David. It reminds me of the same discussions. In a sense, counterterrorism operations, are they effective, especially kind of surveilling people and all that kind of stuff? And obviously you can tell on the basis of how many plots you stop, but you can't necessarily tell beyond that unless they were reasonably close. If it's in the very early stages, you don't know exactly how much you might have deterred people and so on. So it's a little bit of a similar debate, if you like, that we don't know in the end how much we've made an effect and all of those kind of things. We don't know, but what we do know is that there's a lot of events and there's certainly a lot of activity, and in a sense it would be irresponsible to let that activity just happen without knowing what's happening, right? So I think that much we can know, and whether in the end we make much of a difference, whether in the end that activity makes much of a difference, we cannot know, but it's better that we do know, because otherwise we also would be losing a lot of knowledge about what's going on in general. So if there was anything concerning happening, we wouldn't even be aware of it. So I think we better know.
Christian, if I can just follow up on that as well, I think that whether or not it really works, it's people think that it works, and countries think that information campaigns work. And what's been most interesting to me, and I think again, I'm just going to quote quickly from the Soufan Group report on this, is that the Russians entered. And look, they didn't do it in 2016, right? We can go back to the 1960s. We can go back to the 80s. There's tons of things that the Russians have done. So I'm not saying that this is in any way, shape, or form new, although the digital aspect is, of course, alarming with the speed and the velocity of the reach. But it seems that China and Iran and others think that Russia got an effect, and so now they are in the game. Right, so there's a sort of whether or not it worked, people think that it worked. And just bear with me for one sentence from the Soufan report. Russia is often considered the most capable and sophisticated external driver of disinformation. Interestingly, however, our analysis shows that China is currently the state actor most involved in amplifying QAnon narratives on Facebook. In 2020, 44% of posts came from administrators in Russia, 42% from China, 13% from Iran, and 1% from Saudi Arabia. I don't think that the sentence actually doesn't reflect exactly what they're trying to say, because how can China be most effective if Russia has the highest percentage? But what they're trying to talk about is a trend. So whether or not it works, people think that it works, countries think that it works, and so I think we're going to see more noise and more covert influence operations in this space, not less.
I'd be really interested to know what you think of new legislation that's coming out to sort of amend kind of FARA and so on. So there's like for the People Act and things like this. Do you think these things will, maybe have an impact on foreign interference in the United States? Are they helpful?
It's a good question. I'm not trying to punt. I just don't know enough about the specifics of the proposed legislation. Just as an example, every time I think that I know the answer, you know, I get Jedi mind tricked by a colleague who tells me that's all wrong. You know, and just one example I think was you know, regulating Facebook. And the sort of irony there was that you know, because I was sort of in the, you know, some regulation is probably warranted camp. And then someone else told me that now that it's almost like if you've ever played the game of Monopoly, like Facebook has hotels on Park Place and, you know, all the really expensive places. And so if you just freeze the game with regulation, then Facebook can effectively shut out all competitors once, you know, they've sort of, you know, evolved into the environment. So, you know, it's a hard one. And each time I think I know, you know, that something is going to help, you know, some new little wrinkle comes in, and then I go back to the policy drawing board.
Thanks, David. I didn't get a chance at all to come back on the Chinese question and to think about their doctrines of social psychological warfare and unrestricted warfare, and Chinese girls, Huayan Lang from 1999, and a whole host of their developments, and whether or not they've influenced Russia. Because I'd like us to turn to the audience questions, if we may. Can you all see them? Rather than me identify and pick out individuals, because the session's been recorded and because I want this to be seen by as many people as possible, because I think it's been such a valuable and good and fruitful kind of conversation. I'm not just saying that because I'm hosting and all of that. Genuinely, I believe that, and thank you all so much. But can you all see the Q&A questions, and would you like to respond to any?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to the first one there about the Digital Services Act legislation that is being considered by the European Commission to set up accountability mechanism for platforms of varying sizes. Then the second dimension of the question is, would the voluntary aspect of it undermine this objective? And is this type of cooperation an achievable way to combat disinformation campaigns? Now, I think the objective is a good one. I think the objective is a good one, and certainly what they're trying to do is positive. What I also agree with what the question was asking in terms of the voluntary aspect, that we've seen that very often in the regulatory space, that legislators say, well, you know, if we get the companies together and we just hold hands and then they'll do it voluntarily. I'm not 100% sure whether that voluntary aspect is so helpful, because once it's voluntary, you know, it's basically if financially it's advantageous, companies are going to do it. If it's financially problematic, then they're not going to do it. So I think to rely on the financial bottom line for the legislator, I don't know whether that's a good idea, because in a sense that's not a variable that you can influence as a legislator, whether it's financially advantageous or not. So I would have thought it's better to kind of say, well, this is the kind of standard that we're expecting. We're enforcing those standards. We're bringing in mechanisms to enforce those standards. That would be more effective. It's a good first step, right? You know, it's better that they're doing something than if they're not doing something. I think in the end, we're probably going to revise that legislation in a couple of years and then probably think that the voluntary aspect needs to go, because I don't think ultimately that is sufficient. I think it's good that they're starting something, but it's probably not going to be sufficient. So in a couple of years' time, we'll come back to it and we'll have to revise it.
Thank you, Christian. Carl, David, Emma, do you wish to answer any of the other questions?
I'm happy to have a go at the anonymous attendee. So asking about weaponized information, civilian populations. Well, it rather depends on the campaign. There are a lot of actors involved. You're asking, is there a long-term goal? I mean, are we talking about Russia, China here? Maybe yes. In that case, there's probably strategic goals, but there may also be tactical goals. So short range, narrow focus, goals that are aimed at changing a particular scenario that they want to move a pawn in on the chessboard right now. But there may well be, you know, a big plan driving a lot of these things, but also you have other actors engaging in this space. So there's private companies who are also misleading us online. There are, you know, small, large groups, you know, there's all sorts of entities that are responsible for disinformation campaigns and weaponizing information that we need to be aware of. And yes, many actors, potentially no limits. This is huge and a massive arms race, I would say, around the world with all sorts of different countries. I mean, we often hear Russia and China constantly being repeated, but there's you know, all countries have their propaganda machine, if you like, as part of government. And, you know, there obviously propaganda has long been used in the practice of foreign policy. But the question about whether liberal open societies can survive, you know, the West, if you want to call our constituent countries liberal open societies, we have, you know, long been involved in propaganda too. And we have been best at it when we have not sacrificed our liberties, because actually, you know, our biggest selling point is the fact that we do respect journalism, that we have free media, that we create, you know, culture that carries certain principles forward, and that, you know, has tended to, you know, help to promote countries like the United States, in spite of sometimes its illiberal actions. So I would say that, you know, actually not selling out on those principles and making sure we stick to those even more rigidly than we have in the past means that we don't create inconsistencies that can be exploited by our enemies. So I actually think that's a fundamental principle for democracies.
Just on that question, when Donald Trump, amongst other members of the GOP and the GOP base, targets the media as enemies of the people and has traction from it, what do you think may be the net effects of that? Short term, medium term, long term, if any?
Long term, I mean, I think that's actually more damaging than the disinformation that he's pushing, because it gives credibility to that disinformation and to actors that are pushing it. The only way that, you know, people who want to push disinformation can do it is by undermining journalism. Because if, you know, if people believe in the credibility of the media, that, you know, it does proper, decent investigative journalism, then they're not going to be taken up by, you know, outlets that peddle fake news. The issue as well, of course, is that, you know, our media sometimes gets things wrong and has commercial drivers that mean that, you know, and political drivers sometimes that mean that, you know, it can struggle to build credibility within some populations. But this is something that can be very easily weaponized. And I think these kind of credibility attacks are really difficult to deal with, and probably a lot harder to deal with than straight disinformation in itself, because they're the carrier.
Yeah, that's exactly
the message, not the messenger. Sorry, David.
Well, I was just going to say, you know, that what the phenomenon that Emma's talking about, you know, just makes me want to, you know, see if Christian can help me move to, you know, Tasmania and just sort of live out my days on a tiny, you know, little speck of land somewhere, because you know, I'll just be, you know, as a civil servant, yeah, it's really hard, you know, to call out things when you see it, right? Because, you know, as a member of the military and whatever, right, you can't just say that's a lie and that's a lie. You know, and you see it, but you can't, you know, at least from my position, you know, there's not a heck of a lot I can do. And so I like to focus on foreign disinformation. And, you know, and I spend so much time, you know, complaining about the Russians or the Chinese or whatever. because that doesn't get me, angry phone calls. But yeah, the domestic bit just makes me want to, curl up in a ball and give up, because it's the difference between, what is the truth, and you can't know the truth, so you might as well, just not try. And I think that's the demonization of the media, is part and parcel of that. And there's a serving congressman who not too long ago put out a deep fake, but it's actually badly done. So maybe it's a cheap fake of President Obama shaking hands with the leader of Iran, but it wasn't the leader of Iran. It was actually it was photoshopped in. He was shaking hands with the Prime Minister of India. And so, I get on my high horse, talking about, foreign stuff and, coming together as a country. And then when elected officials are, tweeting out, deep fakes for political purposes, yeah, I just look for land in Tasmania to just give up. But I also think, getting back to, I think, one of the questions that Emma, answered as well about, what's the purpose here? And I think it's best understood, there's, as the, the terrorists say, there's a close enemy and a far enemy. There's a long-term goal and there's a short-term goal. And the long-term goal we could talk about, eroding, the social cohesion in the West or whatever. But there's also very short-term goals. And I think two of them are worth bearing in mind. The first one is RT, right? I love watching, I hate watch RT, and I'm very interested in it. And they're always talking about fracking, right? And why are they always talking about fracking? Well, because they don't want the United States to, to develop energy, whether you think that's a good thing or bad thing, because Russia, is the gas station. And so, the more fracking that happens in the US, the less, the Russians control energy supplies. And so, there's a clear geopolitical impetus for that narrative. In the same way, at least here in this country, when it looked like the Syrian rebels were going to defeat the Assad regime, Russia got involved. Now, they got involved in Syria, of course, but they also got involved in the U.S., social media and the domestic sphere by running campaigns that basically said, "Why do you care about Syrians when there's homeless American veterans?" And they've got pictures of these homeless American veterans. Right now, those two things aren't necessarily related. You can care about veterans and also care about Syrian rebels or not. But you see again very specific policy problems that the Russians are trying to address through disinformation campaigns. So you can really, I think, have a good sense of what they care about by looking at what their disinformation campaigns are promoting.
Carl, Christian. By the way, David, I'd love to know what the appeal of Tasmania is to you.
I just want to be left alone, by myself.
Just perhaps one comment about the media, because I think, in a sense, one of the long-term problems when you're constantly attacking the media is that, in a sense, the media is the fabric that holds a democratic society together. If you undermine the media, in a sense, who holds authority to speak truth, right? It is power that speaks truth, and you don't speak truth to power anymore. So that builds the path basically to an authoritarian dictatorship. If you don't have a functioning media anymore, you have built the motorway to authoritarian dictatorship. And that's why, of course, it is, if you look at all of the kind of Russian affiliated organizations all across Europe or in the United States or whatever, they're all talking negatively about the media because they don't like a free press, because a free press is the stumbling block between them and an authoritarian dictatorship. Why? If you look at Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland, one of the first terms that they coined was the Lügenpresse, that's the same term that was used in the 1930s by Hitler. So, they didn't even invent their own new term. They went straight back to the 1930s. That is, in a sense, why it's so dangerous to attack a free press, because once they're gone, in a sense, we're on the road to on a road to authoritarian dictatorships, and obviously there are developments that we can see around the Western world that don't put us there yet, but that are paving some small steps on that road. We're not quite there yet. We're still hopefully still quite far away from it, but we have built some way towards it. And I think that's why we need to be so careful, because once that is gone, you don't know how quickly to rebuild that again. I mean, the sort of democratic culture that we had to build up in the West is not something that you build up overnight. That is something that has been centuries of incremental building, and once you start losing that, you kind of might have lost it for a very long time. So it's very important to preserve that.
Yeah, we've lived through periods of religious and ethnic intoleration, and we've entered a period of increased toleration. You know, it's a lived experience of what can happen. I talked with a number of people over the last probably about 5 years about feeling the sort of comparisons with the 1930s and the conditions that enable that. And you know, one thing was striking me about during lockdown was that it's, you know, explaining the rise of Hitler and fascism is one thing, but it's the conditions that enabled people to stop and listen when they could have walked by. And that sort of speech finds an audience and is received. And that, for me, is you know, an important set of issues. It's those conditions and the existence of, as you say, the pathway, the trackway, the motorway, and the stops along the way, the signposts we recognise because we've seen it 80 years ago. Carl, David, Emma, do you wish to answer any of the other questions, particularly one at the end from the sense anything organisations such as ourselves, proprivacy.com, could do to support such work or get involved? Would any of you like to answer?
I might make a final thought, if I may, around the press, actually, while we're still there. There's a kind of deeper irony here than simply politicians like Trump using social media to berate the press. It's also that the rise of digital platforms completely changed the way advertising worked, which has caused a kind of decades-long gutting, commercially speaking, of the press. So especially Facebook and Google, it heralded a kind of quite a quiet revolution for people outside the field, but they basically told a story to advertising agencies that there was this whole new kind of advertising which was then possible, called programmatic advertising. And what that essentially did was it allowed advertisers to buy space in front of a user, a kind of user, wherever they were on the internet. So you didn't just buy kind of space in a magazine, you would buy space via ad tech anywhere whoever you wanted to reach happened to be. And that completely changed the commercial basis of news. We've seen like ad revenues for newspapers literally decline by 50% in most mature reading markets across the world over the last 10 years. And concomitantly with that, we've seen the number of professional journalists go down by about the same number. Now, the big famous global titles roll onwards, but if you want to look at local press, it's been an absolute bloodbath. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of titles have closed down around the world. Thousands actually around the world, hundreds just in a market like the United States, and they actually have been now put to the ends of information operations. So one of the new trends that we're seeing is kind of hyper partisan local news. So all these political action committees and others basically buying commercially unviable local papers, keeping the masthead, keeping the website, but then running a whole new stream of basically influence operations through it. But, you know, and that's influence operations on a local scale. That's meant to kind of pressure, you know, action around the local judge or the local sheriff. Much scarier, because then you haven't got the New York Times or the Guardian worried about that kind of thing. So it's much more difficult to track. I think Emma has already made the point that, you know, the frustration with journalism in this space is that it just focuses on those big, kind of massive, kind of globally significant and visible issues, and so much of this is happening underneath those horizons. So Trump is entrenching, or Trump helped to entrench already just a massively scary and increasing kind of commercial and financial weakness with news and press, and especially expensive, time-consuming, gritty work that has to do with speaking truth to power, as Christian says, investigative journalism, shoe leather journalism. It's been happening for quite some time. We're beginning to see, especially in the West, kind of charities basically and foundations stepping in, and increasingly seeing kind of press as not as a business concern, but basically a charitable endeavor, which is kind of fine to an extent, but we'll never see the same amount of it, I think, happening as an industry as we saw, say, in the 70s and the 80s and going up to the 90s. Give me another hour and I'll tell you what Fleet Street hacks tell me when they get drunk about the differences between their work now between the 80s, but they're just different worlds in terms of what press men and women actually do. So sorry, a bit of a depressing point perhaps to leave it on, but a very important one, that the story here around press, and the weakening of us as a society being able to basically manufacture truths and do all the things that's needed to kind of defend it at the same time as everything else we've been talking about kind of growing at the same time. It's both of those things happening, which kind of at least kind of causes me to feel very uneasy.
It changes so quickly.
We're at time, David, but yeah, please.
I was just going to say, Carl, it changes so quickly. I mean, the transformation that you're talking about is just so rapid. I mean, even I've written things for one paper that I won't name several years ago that the paper went insane, and I wish I'd never written for them. Because we're not talking about generations. We're just talking about years. But I just wanted to say something about supporting journalism. Because I talk to a lot of students and I ask them if they subscribe to a newspaper, and they say no. And they say, why? I can get whatever I want online and I don't have to pay. And I think one of the problems that we're seeing is that, like, I've been hard on journalists and journalism. I think we all need to do better, educators, society, journalists as well. But there's this idea that students, I think, or young people want the sort of perfect truth. And I say, well, why don't you subscribe to a newspaper? And they say, oh, well, sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes they do get it wrong, but we should still give them $8 a month, to do what they need to do. And they say, well, they don't seem to understand the difference between journalists that get it wrong sometimes, who are too quick to the scoop, and outlets who are actually lying to them, right? It's the difference between, look, the Washington Post or the Guardian can be tendentious at times and it gets annoying. But that's different than RT. That's different than Sputnik. And we've sort of conflated them. And I think we need to do a better job, especially those of us, with teaching roles, to try to sort of help students understand that difference. Thanks, Chris.
I couldn't agree more. And I wouldn't say it's a great way to end, because that would be sort of disingenuous. But the quality of the argument and the quality of the conversation, and if this was a live event, we'd be going out for dinner and we'd be continuing the conversation, internet connection at the same time as well, so I do apologize. So I'm going to end at that point. I can only say from the bottom of my heart, thank you all so very, very much. And
thank you too.
Hopefully be in touch, and please take good care. It's been a pleasure.